Let me tell you about a Tuesday morning in March of 2009, because that morning is where everything actually started, even though nobody standing in that farmyard would have believed it at the time. A flatbed truck pulled through the gate of a small farm outside Broken Bow, Nebraska, and dumped 300 pounds of scrap leather onto the gravel beside Sarah Whitman's barn. The driver didn't knock, he didn't leave a note, he backed the truck up, pulled the release lever, and drove off before the dust had even finished settling around the pile of irregular hides and offcuts and belt strips he'd left behind. Sarah was 30 years old, standing at her kitchen window with a cup of coffee going cold in her hand, watching that pile settle into the dirt like something the county had collectively decided it no longer needed. She stood there a long moment. Then she set the cup down on the counter and walked outside. Nobody in Custer County saw what was coming. Not the tannery, not the crowd at the co-op counter, not the Farm Bureau, and certainly not the man who would, over the following years, become the loudest and most confident voice insisting that whatever Sarah Whitman was doing out in that barn was a nice hobby at best and a slow, quiet waste of her time at worst. Nobody saw it coming. But looking back on it now, it's hard to understand how anyone missed it, because everything you needed to know about what was about to happen was standing right there in that gravel driveway, already thinking about what to do next. Let me tell you about Sarah Whitman, because you need to understand the woman before you can understand anything she built. She was born in 1979, the middle of 3 children in a farmhouse her grandfather had built with his own hands on the flat, open stretch of Custer County wheat ground west of Broken Bow. Her father, Robert Whitman, was a methodical man who farmed 180 acres of wheat and ran a modest herd of Angus cattle the same way his own father had run them, which was the same way his father's father had run them before that. Robert wasn't a man who spent much time doubting the value of doing things the way they'd always been done. He rose at 4:30 every morning, ate the same breakfast, drove the same county roads, and trusted, without needing to examine the trust too closely, that the systems he'd inherited were the systems that would carry him and his family through whatever came. Sarah loved him for that steadiness. She also, from a very young age, could not stop asking why those systems worked the way they worked, which was a kind of question Robert Whitman wasn't always entirely sure how to answer. She wasn't a rebellious child, she was a curious one, and those are two very different things. She helped with the cattle from the time she could walk a fence line without falling. She learned to drive a tractor before most of her classmates had learned to ride a bicycle without training wheels. She spent long Saturday afternoons out in the barn with a flashlight and a wrench, taking things apart that didn't strictly need taking apart, purely to understand how the pieces fit together in the first place. By the time she was 12, she disassembled and reassembled the hydraulic pump on her father's hay baler twice, and the second time she found a hairline crack in the housing that nobody had noticed and fixed it before it could fail out in the field during harvest. Robert Whitman looked at that repair for a long time without saying anything. Then he finally said, "Good eye." That was, in the Whitman household, about as close to high praise as a man like Robert ever gave out. She went to the University of Nebraska on a partial scholarship, studying agricultural business alongside materials science, an unusual pairing that her academic advisor described, in a tone that suggested he meant slightly different, as ambitious. She had a professor there, a woman named Patricia Hensley, who taught a course on small-scale manufacturing and material life cycles, and who told her students on the very first day of that class that the single most undervalued resource in American agriculture wasn't land, wasn't water, it wasn't even labor. It was waste. Not what you grew, what you threw away. Sarah wrote that line down in her notebook. She underlined it twice. She carried that idea back home to Custer County when she graduated in 2001, and she carried it quietly with her for the next 8 years while she worked her father's farm and helped him weather the slow financial tightening that came with mid-decade commodity price swings and rising input costs and all the other patient, grinding pressures reshaping the economics of small family farms across the Great Plains during those years. She married a man named Mark Whitman, a mechanic out of the nearby town of Ansley who kept his shop meticulously, almost obsessively organized, and who understood, better than most people Sarah had known, that the real difference between a good tool and a bad one was almost never price. It was design. He had opinions about leather. He had opinions about stitching. He had strong, specific opinions about what a work belt actually needed to do out on a job site, and equally strong opinions about all the ways most commercial work belts quietly failed to do it. He shared those opinions with Sarah over dinner most evenings, in the particular way a man shares things with a woman he trusts to eventually do something about them. She listened. She always listened. Let me tell you about the tannery now, because it's the other half of this whole story, and it's the half that most people who know the Whitman name have never once heard properly told. The Custer County Leather Works had been running since 1958, processing hides from regional feedlots and producing industrial leather primarily for agricultural equipment belts, heavy drive straps, and reinforced aprons sold to meatpacking plants across the region. By the mid-2000s, it employed 42 people and processed something close to 3,800 hides a year. It wasn't a glamorous operation. It smelled the particular way tanneries smell, which is a smell most people around Broken Bow had simply learned to stop noticing years earlier rather than move away from. The tannery generated a steady volume of waste leather along the way, the irregular cuts and edge trimmings and split-off pieces that fell below the minimum dimensions required by its industrial clients. That scrap wasn't useless material exactly, it was just inconvenient. Too small for drive belts, too irregular in shape for aprons, too inconsistent in thickness to process efficiently at industrial scale. For years, the tannery had simply been paying to haul it all to a landfill over in Dawson County, a bill that ran roughly $7,500 in disposal fees alone. In 2008, a man named Tom Baxter, who managed daily operations at the tannery, decided that the landfill arrangement was an unnecessary ongoing expense and that farmers around the county with plenty of open land and no particular objection to free material might make for a considerably cheaper solution. He started informally offering to dump scrap loads at nearby farms in exchange for absolutely nothing. No payment, no written contract, no formal arrangement of any kind, just a phone call and then a truck. Several farmers around the county said yes without thinking twice about it. Robert Whitman said yes for the simplest reason there was. Free material was free material, and he figured he could probably find some use for leather scraps around the barn eventually. He mentioned it to Sarah over breakfast one morning in late 2008, almost as an afterthought. She set down her fork. She asked him exactly how much they were getting and how often. He told her what he knew. She picked her fork back up, finished her eggs, and didn't say much else for the rest of that meal. But she was thinking. That first load arrived in March of 2009, 300 pounds of mixed tannery scrap dumped unceremoniously into the gravel. Sarah walked out to it and spent close to 2 hours sorting through the pile with her bare hands, separating pieces by thickness, by surface quality, by moisture content, by whatever she could see and feel about the grain structure running through each individual piece. She'd already been reading seriously about leatherworking for the previous 6 months by that point. She'd ordered 3 books from a supplier out of Denver and a 4th from a small craft school in Vermont. She'd watched instructional videos late into the evenings and studied the construction of work belts and tool holsters, paying close attention to the specific ways professional-grade leather goods differed structurally from the cheap nylon and molded plastic alternatives that had quietly taken over most of the market by the 1990s. She'd also been talking with Mark, who told her that every tradesman he personally knew either owned exactly one good leather tool belt they'd bought 15 years earlier and were still wearing, or owned 4 cheap ones that kept falling apart within a couple years. There was, in his experience, essentially no real middle ground. The market had collapsed toward the cheap end, and the good end had been quietly abandoned by anyone still trying to sell to ordinary working people. She carried a piece of the scrap leather inside that same afternoon, a thick shoulder cut, roughly 14 inches by 9, with clean grain across most of its surface and a slight irregularity along one edge that would trim away cleanly enough. She laid it flat on the kitchen table and studied it for a while. Then she walked back out to the barn and found her father's old saddle stitching awl. Have you ever looked at something everyone else around you was throwing away and quietly wondered whether they might be wrong about it? And have you ever had that exact thought and then simply let it pass because the distance between having the thought and actually doing something about it felt like more than you were willing to cross that day? Sarah Whitman was not built to let that particular gap stop her. She was built to go get the all. Let me tell you about the first belt, because the first belt is the reason any of the rest of this ever mattered at all. It took her 11 days to finish it, working evenings after the farm chores were done, and weekend mornings before the day's real work began. She had no pattern to start from. She drafted her own on a sheet of brown paper, working from measurements she took off one of Mark's old belts and 3 other second-hand belts she'd picked up at a farm auction over in Ansley. She cut the pieces from the scrap leather using a rotary cutter and a steel straight edge, punched every hole by hand with the awl, and stitched the whole thing together with waxed linen thread using a 2-needle saddle stitch she'd taught herself entirely from a library book. A stitch specifically chosen because it locks itself in place, meaning that if any single section of thread ever fails, the rest of the seam still holds firm. She used brass hardware throughout, rivets and D-rings and a roller buckle she'd ordered special from a harness supplier over in Grand Island. The finished belt weighed just under 2 pounds. It had 4 tool loops, a dedicated hammer loop, 2 open pockets, and 1 main pouch closed with a simple snap. It wasn't beautiful. The stitching ran slightly uneven in 2 visible places, and one of the pockets sat a full 1/4 inch lower than she'd originally intended. But it was solid. The particular kind of solid you feel settle into your hands before your brain has even finished registering why. The unmistakable sense that whatever you're holding is not going to fail on you. She gave it to Mark. He wore it for a full week without saying anything specific about it either way. Then, one Friday evening, he came home from the shop, set the belt down carefully on the kitchen counter, and said, "Pocket needs to sit about 1/2 inch higher, and that hammer loop needs reinforcing right at the base, or it's going to tear loose inside a year." He paused. "Other than that, it's the best belt I've ever worn in my life." Sarah wrote both notes down in her notebook word for word. She started the second belt the following week. Let me tell you about what happened at the co-op in the spring of 2010, because that's where the story takes its first real public turn. The Prairie Valley Co-op in Custer County was the kind of place where the important conversations happened before they ever happened anywhere else in the county. It was a low building with a concrete floor and a counter worn smooth by 40 years of elbows leaning on it, run by a man named Frank Dolan, who'd been selling seed and chemicals and equipment parts to Custer County farmers since 1985. Frank wasn't a cruel man, he was a certain man, which in some ways is considerably harder to argue with than cruelty ever is. He'd spent long enough farming alongside and selling to the agricultural community around Broken Bow that he'd developed a comprehensive theory of what worked and what didn't in that county. And his theory did not include a 31-year-old woman making tool belts out of tannery scrap in her father's barn. Sarah had been selling her belts for about 6 months by that point. She'd started with Mark's colleagues down at the shop in Ansley, then moved on to a few contractors over in Kearney, then to a hardware store in Callaway that agreed to carry 6 belts on consignment. She was selling them for $85 each, which ran $40 more than the standard nylon and plastic belt at the farm supply chain, and $40 less than the premium leather belts from established manufacturers. She was producing roughly 12 belts a month, which was about all she could manage on top of her regular farm work, and she was using every single scrap load the tannery delivered, which by then had settled into a regular rhythm, arriving every 6 to 8 weeks in loads running anywhere from 200 to 400 pounds. She walked into the Prairie Valley Co-op one morning in April of 2010 to ask Frank Dolan whether he'd be willing to carry a few belts on his shelves. She had 2 samples with her in a canvas bag, and she set them on the counter between them. Frank picked one up, turned it over slowly, examined the stitching, pressed his thumb into the leather, and set it back down. He looked at the price tag she'd attached, which read $90. The silence lasted about 2 full seconds, then he started laughing. It wasn't exactly a mean laugh. It was the laugh of a man who has watched a great many things fail to work out over the years and has developed something close to a reflex for spotting the next one coming. It was a laugh built entirely out of institutional confidence, The particular sound of a man who believes he knows the market, knows the customer, knows the whole county, and genuinely cannot quite believe that someone is standing in front of him with a canvas bag full of handmade leather belts priced at $90 apiece. "Sarah," he said, and his voice carried the particular gentleness of a man explaining something simple to a child. "The fellas who come in here, they're not buying $90 tool belts. They're buying the $30 belt over at the farm store, and they're replacing it every couple years, and they're just fine with that arrangement." He pushed the belt back across the counter toward her. "This is a real nice hobby. I mean that sincerely." Sarah picked both belts back up and returned them to the canvas bag. She looked at Frank Dolan for a moment. "How much do they spend on 2 of those cheap belts over 10 years?" she asked. He blinked, caught slightly off guard. "Because mine last 10 years. I've got the stitching data to prove it." Frank smiled the particular smile of a man who had already made his mind well before the conversation started. "Good luck with it," he said. She drove home that afternoon with the windows down. She didn't mention the conversation to Mark that evening. She simply sat down with her notebook and wrote 3 separate lines. The first read, "Stitching durability data, need formal test results." The second read, "Price resistance at $90, test $110 with premium positioning." The third read, simply, "Frank Dolan said no, come back in 2 years."
Let me tell you about the actual science behind what Sarah was doing, because it's the part that almost everyone who laughed at her over the following years never once bothered to properly understand. The standard tool belt sold through farm supply and hardware chains back in 2010 was manufactured from split leather, which is the lower layer of a hide left over once the top grain has already been removed for use in premium goods, or else made from synthetic materials bonded to a plain textile backing. Split leather is considerably cheaper to produce and considerably easier to work with at industrial scale, but it carries a real fundamental structural weakness. The grain layer, the outermost surface of any hide, and the specific part that contains the tightly interlocked fiber structure responsible for leather's actual strength, has already been stripped away entirely. What's left behind is a looser, more porous material that absorbs moisture readily, stretches noticeably under load, and breaks down at its stress points considerably faster than genuine top-grain leather ever does. A split leather belt in daily use, carrying 8 to 12 pounds of tools and flexing several hundred times a day at the exact same points, will typically begin showing real failure right at the punch holes and stitch lines within 18 to 24 months. That isn't a manufacturing defect, it's a predictable, entirely expected material outcome. The scrap leather the Custer County Leather Works had been dumping onto Sarah's gravel driveway was not split leather at all. It was top-grain offcuts left over from industrial belt production, pieces rejected not for any quality defect whatsoever, but purely for dimensional irregularity. The grain structure running through it remained fully intact. The fiber density matched exactly what you'd find in premium saddlery leather anywhere in the country. What it lacked was simply size, nothing more. What Sarah had worked out, drawing on her materials science background and on Dr. Hensley's old principle about the genuine value hiding inside waste, was that a properly built tool belt doesn't actually require large, continuous pieces of leather at all. It requires strategically placed pieces of exactly the right thickness in exactly the right locations, joined together by stitching strong enough to transfer real load evenly across every seam. A saddle stitch worked in properly tensioned waxed linen thread carries a tensile strength that genuinely exceeds the tear strength of top-grain leather itself at the stitch holes, which means, in practical terms, that the leather will always fail before the seam ever does. Which means the true limiting factor in how long a belt actually lasts isn't the stitching at all, it's the leather. And her leather, sourced for nothing from a pile the tannery was otherwise paying to bury, was the best available anywhere in the region. She'd run her own formal tests to prove it, rather than simply asserting it. She made 12 identical test panels, 6 cut from her tannery scrap, and 6 cut from the same split leather used in the standard $30 commercial belts. She loaded each panel with a hanging 15-pound weight and cycled it through a flex test, bending each panel through a 90-degree arc 500 times a day, closely approximating the real load and movement of an actual working belt. She photographed every panel weekly and carefully recorded the condition of the stitch holes and surface grain each time. At 8 weeks, the commercial split leather panels already showed visible fiber separation right at the punch holes. At 12 weeks, 3 of the 6 had cracked clean along their primary flex line. At 24 weeks, all 6 commercial panels had failed outright. All 6 of her own panels remained fully intact. She had the photographs. She had the dated notes. She kept the whole folder in the kitchen drawer, right beside her notebook. She also had the economics worked out cold. The tannery delivered scrap leather to her barn entirely free of charge. Her real material cost per belt came down to just the hardware, the thread, and a handful of consumables: brass rivets, roller buckles, D-rings, waxed linen thread, running somewhere between $9 and $14 per belt depending on the specific configuration. Her own labor, which she wasn't yet formally paying herself for in any real sense, ran approximately 6 hours per belt. Her selling price that year sat at $90. Her gross margin on materials alone ran above 80%. The actual constraint on her business was never profitability. It was time and it was distribution.
Let me tell you about the years between 2010 and 2013, because those are the years most people skip straight past when they tell this story, and they're exactly the years that made everything else that followed actually possible. Sarah didn't quit the farm. She didn't take out a loan. She didn't hire anyone yet. She worked the farm alongside her father through the daylight hours and made belts in the evenings and on weekend mornings, and she sold them through every single channel she could find that didn't require walking back through Frank Dolan's door. She sold at farm auctions around the county. She sold at the Custer County Fair, where she rented a 10-foot table for $40 and sold 11 belts across 2 days, coming home with $990 and a growing list of names and phone numbers from people already asking when she'd have more ready. She sold to a plumbing supply house in Kearney that agreed to keep a small display case near their front counter. She sold to a roofing contractor over in Ansley who ordered 6 belts at once for his whole crew, then called her back 3 months later just to say his guys kept asking where they could get more for themselves. She placed a small classified ad in a regional agricultural newspaper that over the course of a single year generated 47 separate orders reaching across Nebraska and into Kansas and South Dakota. She also steadily got better at the actual craft. The stitching that had run slightly uneven on that very first belt was perfectly consistent by the time she reached her 50th. She developed a real system for grading every incoming scrap load, sorting each piece by thickness and grain quality, and assigning each grade to a specific component within the belt itself. The heaviest, densest pieces became the main body and the tool pockets. The medium weight pieces became the loops and backing panels. The lightest, thinnest pieces became interior liners and closure flaps. Nothing went to waste. The smallest offcuts, pieces too small for any structural component at all, she started turning into small leather key fobs and tool roll straps, selling those for $12 a piece with a material cost that was functionally zero. In 2011, she sold 230 belts and roughly 550 small accessories. In 2012, she sold 290 belts and well over 900 accessories. Her revenue that year came in just under $38,000. Her material cost ran about $10,500 in hardware and thread. The leather itself still cost her nothing at all. Mark had left the shop in Ansley by then and was working full-time on the farm alongside Robert, helping Sarah with the belt operation on the side. He'd built her a proper cutting table out in the barn, and a wall-mounted storage system for sorting the graded leather, and a small hand press for setting rivets that ran faster and considerably more consistently than the hand tools she'd been using since the very beginning. He'd also, quietly and without ever making a production of it, started telling every tradesman he personally knew that his wife made the single best tool belt they'd ever own in their life, and that they ought to give her a call. That word of mouth alone generated close to 30% of her 2012 orders. She knew the exact figure because she asked every new customer how they'd first heard about her, and she wrote every single answer down in her notebook without fail. Robert Whitman watched all of this unfold from a careful, respectful distance. He wasn't an obstructive man by nature. He'd given her the barn space without her ever having to ask for it, and he'd never once suggested the leather operation was pulling her attention away from the farm work that still needed doing.
But he was a wheat farmer, and wheat farmers in Custer County carried a particular well-worn relationship to the whole concept of diversification, which was, generally speaking, that it was something other people did when they weren't entirely sure what they were doing with their own operation. He watched the numbers anyway. He watched the orders come steadily in. He watched the barn fill up with carefully sorted leather and then slowly empty back out again as finished belts went out the door toward customers he'd never met. He didn't say a great deal about any of it, but Sarah noticed over time that he'd started reading the order book she kept out on the kitchen counter, and that he read it the exact same careful, expressionless way he read the weekly commodity price reports. In the spring of 2013, he came to her after dinner one evening, sat down across from her at the kitchen table, and asked her plainly, "How much space do you actually need?" She looked at him, uncertain for a moment where the question was headed. "If you had more room to work with," he said, "would you make more belts?" "Yes," she said. "I've got the old equipment shed sitting empty," he said. "You can have it." He stood up, picked up his coffee cup, and walked back into the living room without waiting for a reply. That was the whole conversation. That was Robert Whitman quietly telling her he'd been watching all along, and that he'd made up his mind. Sarah sat at the kitchen table a while longer after he left the room. Then she opened her notebook and wrote, "Equipment Shed Conversion Plan. Hire first employee. Target 600 belts a year." Let me tell you now about the Custer County Farm Bureau meeting in October of 2013, because that's where Frank Dolan made a mistake he'd end up spending the next several years quietly regretting. The Farm Bureau held its quarterly meetings at the community center in Broken Bow, the kind of meetings where the printed agenda always ran considerably longer than the actual time allotted, and where the real conversations tended to happen out in the parking lot afterward rather than in the room itself. Sarah had been attending for close to 2 years by then, partly because her father had always attended without fail, and partly because she'd come to understand that the Farm Bureau meetings were where the county's informal economic consensus quietly got formed, and she wanted to understand exactly how that worked. She generally sat near the back and listened more than she spoke. Frank Dolan sat on the Agricultural Diversification Committee that year, a committee that existed specifically to encourage local farmers to explore income sources beyond their primary commodity. He gave a brief presentation that October on small-scale, value-added enterprises, a category that included things like farm-direct vegetable stands, agritourism ventures, and artisan food production. He ran through a short list of local examples. He mentioned a woman over in Dawson County who'd built a small business making goat cheese. He mentioned a family up near Callaway running a corn maze every fall. He did not mention Sarah Whitman, who was sitting 12 rows behind him that evening with a notebook resting in her lap, and who had, by that point, generated well over $55,000 in revenue from a product built entirely out of material that the county's largest leather processor had, until quite recently, been paying good money to bury in a landfill. After the meeting broke up, out in the parking lot, someone asked Frank Dolan directly what he thought of the Whitman belt operation, which had by then become something most people around the county had at least heard mentioned, even if they didn't entirely understand what it actually was. Frank looked at the man who'd asked and answered with the particular confidence of someone who'd been right about most things for most of a long career. "I think it's a nice little side business," he said. "I think she's going to hit a wall once she runs out of people willing to pay $100 for a tool belt, and I expect she'll go back to farming full-time. And honestly, that'll be just fine." He paused for a moment. "The market for handmade goods has a ceiling. It always has." 3 people standing nearby heard him say it. One of them mentioned it to Sarah the following week, repeating it as close to word for word as he could manage. She wrote it down in her notebook exactly the way he'd said it. Then she turned the page and wrote out her production targets for the coming year. Let me tell you about the equipment shed, because the equipment shed is where everything actually changed to real scale. Mark spent most of November and December of 2013 converting it. He insulated the walls, wired it properly for lighting, built a run of workbenches along the south wall, and installed a ventilation system that kept the leather dust from ever building up into something unmanageable. He built a pattern library along the north wall,
a series of plywood templates for every single component of every belt configuration Sarah had developed, each one hung on a hook and labeled in her own handwriting. He built a drying rack for finished belts and a staging area for outgoing orders. By January of 2014, the whole shed was fully operational. It smelled like leather and sawdust and linseed oil, which is one of the better combinations of smells a working space can carry. Sarah hired her first employee that February. Her name was Maria Torres, 23 years old, who'd grown up on a farm outside Ansley and had a background in 4-H leatherwork she'd never once thought of as professionally useful until Sarah called her directly. Sarah spent 3 full weeks teaching Maria the saddle stitch, the grading system, the component cutting process, and every quality standard she'd developed over 5 years of making belts entirely on her own. Maria learned fast. By the end of March, she was turning out finished belts Sarah genuinely couldn't distinguish from her own on inspection. By the end of April, she'd actually gotten faster at the stitching itself. The production target for 2014 had been 600 belts. They hit 680. Revenue came in at $96,000. Material cost ran $26,000. Net margin, after Maria's wages and the shed's operating costs and all the hardware and thread, landed just over 58%. The tannery kept delivering scrap for free the whole time. Tom Baxter had, by that point, worked out that the arrangement was saving him roughly $8,500 a year in disposal fees and had gone ahead and formalized it with a simple signed letter of agreement giving Sarah right of first refusal on all offcuts above a set minimum thickness. She'd signed it back in 2012. She'd been the only farmer receiving scrap who'd ever thought to ask for anything in writing at all. The orders were coming from considerably farther away by then, too. A construction supply house in Grand Island placed a standing order for 15 belts a month. A regional distributor out of Oklahoma City reached out after spotting the belts at a trade show in Tulsa, where Sarah had rented half a booth for $250 and sold 31 belts across 2 days. A roofing supply company in Denver placed a trial order for 20 belts. The hardware store in Callaway had grown from 6 belts on consignment to a standing monthly order of 12. Mark had built a simple website that was generating close to 18% of total orders from people who'd found her purely by searching for something like American-made leather tool belt or handmade work belt. Let me tell you about the drought year of 2014, because it's the part of this story most people who actually know the Whitman names still remember clearest, and it's the part that finally answers the question Frank Dolan had never once thought to ask. That summer was the driest Custer County had seen in 9 years. The wheat crop across the whole county came in at somewhere around 42% of normal yield. Robert Whitman's 180 acres produced 29 bushels an acre against an average closer to 74. At that summer's commodity price, that worked out to a loss of roughly $34,000 against what he'd projected for the year. He wasn't alone in it. Across the county, farm families were running numbers that had no good answer waiting at the end of them, drawing down operating lines of credit, putting off equipment maintenance another season, watching the sky, hoping for something better the following year. Sarah's belt operation had its best quarter of the entire year that same summer. Revenue from July through September came in at $32,000. The leather was still free. The drought hadn't touched the tannery's production at all. It hadn't touched demand from construction workers in Grand Island or roofers in Denver or tradesmen in Oklahoma City either. The drought hadn't touched anything about what Sarah had built because what she'd built was never actually connected to the weather the way wheat farming was connected to it. It was connected to something else entirely. It was connected to the simple fact that she'd looked at waste material and seen real value sitting inside it, and had built a whole production system around that value, one that turned out to be insulated from the exact specific risks that had been slowly, quietly compressing the margins of every wheat farm in the county for the better part of 2 decades. Robert sat down at the kitchen table one evening in August of 2014 and looked over the farm's financial summary for the year, then looked over the belt operation's monthly revenue report, which Sarah had started printing out and leaving on the counter without much comment. He sat there a long while. Then he said, "You were right." He said it quietly, the way a man says something he's been slowly working his way towards saying for a while. Sarah was standing over by the counter. She didn't say anything back right away. She just nodded. "What do you need?" he said. She told him she needed 2 more employees, a second cutting press, and a proper dedicated shipping station. "Do it," he said. He stood up and walked outside. She heard the screen door swing shut behind him, and then she didn't hear anything else for a good while, and she understood, without needing to check, that he was standing out on the porch looking at his own dry fields, thinking through what he'd just said, and meaning every word of it. Let me tell you about the fall of 2015, because that's when Frank Dolan finally came out to the barn. He drove out on a Wednesday afternoon in October, unannounced, in his own pickup truck, which was how most of the genuinely serious conversations in Custer County tended to start. Sarah was out in the equipment shed when he pulled in. Maria was at the stitching bench. 2 other women, both hired earlier that year, were working at the cutting tables. The shed smelled like leather, and the afternoon light came in through the south-facing windows in long, flat rectangles laid across the workbenches. Frank stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the whole operation. Then he took his cap off. "I heard you're doing $1 million, he said. "Not quite," Sarah said. "What are you actually doing?" "About $650,000 this year," she said. "We'll clear $1 million next year, most likely." He put his cap back on and looked over the wall of pattern templates, then the grading system laid out for the incoming leather, then the shelf of finished belts waiting to ship. "I told you it had a ceiling," he said. Sarah looked at him. "You told me the market for handmade goods has a ceiling," she said. "Always has." She had it exactly, word for word. He blinked. "I didn't build a handmade goods business. I built a manufacturing operation that uses handcraft methods to make a product the market was underserving. There's a real difference." He was quiet a moment. Then he said, "I'd like to carry your belts." "I know," she said. She walked over to the shipping station, picked up a folder, and handed it to him. It was a wholesale pricing sheet. He looked it over. "This your wholesale price?" he asked. "Yes." "That's higher than I figured." "Yes," she said. "I'll take 20 to start." "Minimum order's 30, she said. "Net 30 terms. I'll need a signed agreement." He looked at her a long moment. "All right," he said. He took the folder, walked back to his truck, and drove off down the county road. Sarah watched him go from the shed doorway. Then she went back inside and told Maria what had just happened, and Maria laughed, and Sarah laughed right along with her, which was the first time she'd genuinely laughed about Frank Dolan since that April morning back in 2010. By 2016, Sarah had 6 employees working out of the equipment shed and a real waiting list building up for custom orders. She'd added a line of tool rolls and leather aprons and small handled pouches, all built from the smaller scrap grades that would otherwise have gone unused. She'd struck up a relationship with a second tannery over in Kearney that had heard about the Custer County arrangement and called to ask whether she wanted their scrap as well. She said yes. She now had more leather coming in than she could process at her current capacity, which meant she needed to expand, which meant she needed real capital, which meant she needed to make a genuine decision about how to grow without losing the exact thing that made the product what it was in the first place. She didn't take on outside investment. She didn't approach a bank for a large expansion loan. She didn't license the brand out or move production to a contract manufacturer somewhere cheaper. She expanded the equipment shed a second time, hired 4 more people, built a formal training program based on the same system she'd used to teach Maria, and raised her prices by 12%. She wrote in her notebook that same week, "The leather is free, the knowledge is not. Price accordingly." In the spring of 2017, a writer for a regional business magazine out of Omaha drove out to the farm and spent a full day with Sarah, then wrote up the belt operation for a feature story. It ran under the headline, "From Scrap to Craft, How a Custer County Farm Wife Built a 6-Figure Tool Belt Business from Tannery Waste." Sarah didn't care for the headline at all. She called the writer directly and told him, plainly, "I'm not a farm wife, I'm a manufacturer." He apologized, and the online version ran with a corrected headline within the day. The story itself was solid, though. It laid out the material science, the production system, the tannery relationship, the actual economics behind the whole thing. It got picked up by a national trade publication that covered small manufacturers, and that publication happened to be read by a buyer at a regional hardware chain based in Tulsa, who'd been actively looking for genuinely American-made work gear to add to a premium section of his company's stores. He called Sarah directly in June of 2017. She took the call sitting at her kitchen table with her notebook open in front of her, the way she always kept it. The Tulsa chain ran 41 stores spread across Oklahoma, Kansas, and southern Missouri. They wanted to carry 3 separate belt configurations. Minimum commitment was 350 units a quarter across all their locations combined. Sarah did the math right there in her notebook while the buyer was still talking. "I can do that," she said. "Can you guarantee consistent quality at that kind of volume?" he asked. "Yes." "How?" "Because I built the system before I ever built the volume," she said. "Call any of my current wholesale accounts and ask them yourself." He called 3 of them. He called her back the following week. "We'd like to start in September," he said. "I'll need a signed purchase order and 30% down," she said. "That's not standard," he said. "It is for me," she said. He was quiet a moment. Then he said, "All right." That single contract pushed Sarah's operation past the $450,000 revenue mark for the remainder of 2017. The following year, with the Tulsa chain relationship now fully established and a second regional distributor added on top of it, revenue crossed $700,000. In 2019, the year Sarah turned 40, the company crossed $1 million in annual revenue for the very first time. She wrote the number down in her notebook, underlined it once, and then went to go start dinner like it was any other evening. Robert Whitman died in January of 2020, 79 years old, from heart failure that came with almost no warning at all, and ended quietly in the same house he'd been born in decades earlier. He'd watched the belt operation grow over 11 years from a pile of scrap leather settling into his gravel driveway into a company with 11 employees and genuine national distribution. He'd never once in all those years said anything that could be read as real surprise at any of it. He'd watched. He'd handed over the equipment shed without being asked twice. He'd said, "You were right," that one evening in the summer of 2014, and hadn't needed to say it again because the numbers said it for him every single month after that. At his funeral, the pastor said that Robert Whitman had always been a man who trusted what he could see with his own eyes and measure with his own hands. Sarah sat in the front pew and thought that was exactly right, and that she'd learned that same habit directly from him. Let me tell you about the tannery, because the tannery's part in this story didn't end where you might expect it to. Tom Baxter retired from the Custer County Leather Works in 2018. Before he left, he sat down with Sarah and told her this scrap arrangement, which had by then been running for 9 years straight, had saved the tannery somewhere around $68,000 in disposal fees over its whole lifetime. "I want you to know we got something real out of this, too," he told her. "I know. That's exactly why it lasted." "New management's going to want to renegotiate the terms," he said. "I know that too," she said. She'd already drafted a revised agreement, one that formalized the delivery schedule, set a guaranteed minimum, and included a clear first right of refusal clause on any material above her set thickness threshold. The new management signed it without changes in March of 2019. The delivery truck kept coming every 6 to 8 weeks, exactly like always. The leather stayed free. By 2022, Sarah's company had 13 employees, all of them trained in the saddle stitch and the grading system and the same quality standards she'd worked out for herself starting with that very first 11-day belt back in 2009. The company was selling through 44 retail locations, plus a direct-to-consumer website that had grown to account for 36% of total revenue. Average selling price on a belt had climbed to $158. Material cost per belt had crept up to somewhere between $17 and $22 as hardware prices rose across the industry, but the leather itself still remained free. Gross margin on the belt line stayed above 60%. Frank Dolan had been carrying her belts at the Prairie Valley Co-op since 2015. He sold an average of 19 a month. Over the years, he developed a standard little speech he gave to any customer who picked one up, looked at the price tag, and started to set it back down. A speech laying out the material, the construction, the real longevity, the honest math of total cost over 10 years. It was, more or less, exactly the same argument Sarah had made to him across his own counter back in April of 2010. He gave it without ever once mentioning where it had actually come from. She'd never once asked him to. Let me tell you one last thing, because this story doesn't really end with revenue figures, and it doesn't end with Frank Dolan's slow change of heart either, and it doesn't even end with the $1,000,000 year Sarah marked with a single underline in her notebook. In the spring of 2023, Sarah's daughter, a 19-year-old named Emma who was finishing her first year at the University of Nebraska studying environmental science, came home for spring break and sat down at the kitchen table where her mother had once sat, years earlier, with a single piece of tannery scrap and an old saddle-stitching owl. Emma had a folder with her. She opened it and spread several pages of notes and printed research across the table. "I want to talk to you about vegetable tanning," she said. Sarah looked at the papers. "The tannery's using chrome tanning. It's industry standard. It's what everybody does. But there's a market for vegetable tanned leathers that's close to 3 times the size of the whole premium work gear market, and nobody in this whole region is producing it at any real scale. If we could get the tannery to run a vegetable tanned line and give us first access to those offcuts too, we could launch a second product line straight into the heritage goods market, and the overlap with our existing customers would be substantial." She had real data with her. She had market research. She had a professor at the university who'd connected her with a small tannery out in Vermont that had already made that exact transition and was willing to consult on the process. She had her own notebook. Sarah looked at the folder for a long time. She looked at her daughter, sitting across the same kitchen table, with a particular expression of someone who's already done the actual work and knows it, and is simply waiting to see whether the person across from her will understand that. Sarah thought about that Tuesday morning back in March of 2009, and a truck driving off while 300 pounds of scrap leather settled slowly into her gravel driveway. She thought about Frank Dolan's laugh across his own counter. She thought about the old awl she'd carried in from her father's barn. She thought about Dr. Hensley saying on the very first day of a college class that the most undervalued resource in American agriculture wasn't land or water or labor, but waste. She thought about all of it for roughly 10 seconds. Then she said, "Show me the numbers." Emma turned to the second page of her folder. Outside, the county road ran flat and straight toward the horizon the way it always had. The equipment shed sat exactly where the old one used to stand. The tannery trucks still came every 6 to 8 weeks, same as they always had. And somewhere out in the barn, there was still a first-generation Whitman tool belt hanging on a nail where Mark had put it years earlier and never once taken down, the one with the slightly uneven stitching and the pocket sitting a 1/4 inch too low. It was the kind of thing you kept not because it was perfect, but because it was proof that you'd actually started. Because it answered, once and for all, the question of whether the gap between having a thought and actually acting on it was ever really too wide to cross. It wasn't. She'd planted a business in a scrap pile. They laughed. The drought came. The wheat died back. The belts kept going out the door. The tannery kept delivering. The notebook kept filling up, page after page. And the woman who'd once stood at a kitchen window watching a truck drive away had built something that would, in the end, outlast the truck, outlast the tannery in its original form, and outlast every single ceiling anyone in Custer County had ever bothered naming out loud. The story is now complete, from the opening truck delivery all the way through Emma's vegetable tanning proposal and the closing lines.